Comparing birth with psychedelics is also not new. The problem with it is nobody ever had the idea to talk to women how it is to birth.
Our next speaker is Julia Mandoki. She is a human rights activist, and she will tell us more about psychedelic feminism. Julia, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. So nice to be here today. We're going to talk about this very big, complex topic. It was very hard to choose what to leave out because it's such a big field. But I want to give a little bit of an introduction of what women, feminism, and psychedelics have in common. A little bit about myself. I have an academic background in religious studies and in anthropology. And for many years, I worked in the Institute of Holistic Medicine in Munich, where we fostered conversations between indigenous knowledge and Western science. But the past years, I've been working as a women's rights activist with different NGOs across the globe to ensure safe access to reproductive care for women and pregnant people. I have nothing to declare. And before we start, I want to ask the question, what might have a medieval midwife and Albert Hofmann have in common, you wonder? Well, they both worked with ergot in the search for medication that would contract the uterus. Long before Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD in 1938, ergot was used for a wide range of purposes to save women's lives, whether it was to induce abortions or to prevent postnatal hemorrhage or to help with complicated labor during childbirth. The knowledge about ergot was in the hands of women, and therefore also in many European languages it is called the grain of the mother, Mutterkuren in Dutch, or in Hungarian, my mother tongue, Anyaros, or in German, Mutterkorn. So, unfortunately, with the witch hunt, this big body of pharmacological knowledge, also about psychedelic plants in Europe, got completely destroyed. So what do I want to do today? I'm going to quickly define the terminologies I'm going to work with, and then I'm going to look at shared histories of women and psychedelics in Europe, and phenomenological overlap between psychedelic phenomena and certain reproductive phenomena in women, and look what we can learn from that. My definitions, I already said the word women, and I'm going to use the word feminine, female body as well. It's very important to declare that this is a culturally constructed term that is very fluid and defined by many different things. So I want everyone who has a uterus to feel included when I say these words, or anyone who identifies as. Next one, transcendence, defined by the APA as a state in which an individual is able to look beyond themselves and adopt a larger perspective that includes concerns for others. And you wonder, what does feminism have to do with all of this? Well, there are actually more feminisms than psychedelic substances. But that's not what the talk's going to be about, don't worry. So feminism to me is essentially psychedelic because it has in common with psychedelics that it is expanding certain ways we look at the world and deconstructing certain identities and hierarchies. And the term psychedelic feminism was first coined by Zoe Helene, who was an eco-feminist. What is ecofeminism? That leads me to the first intersection, psychedelics and women, a shared history of repression. Historian Caroline Marchant analyzed in her work The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology and the Scientific Revolution, how we transitioned in Europe from a place where we had a more of an organismic worldview to a mechanistic worldview. A brief breakdown of this is that we're like in late stage Renaissance at the moment, where feminine was more associated with nature, which was mostly framed by two main archetypes, either feminine as being like a nurturing, motherly force defined by beauty and a giving element, and the other archetype, which is more like madness and chaos. Later, nature was more and more seen as a disorder that was in need to be controlled. Well, that further led to the subjugation of women on a lot of different levels in society. And Caroline Marchand says that women were more and more seen as inferior to men due to their phenomenological closeness to nature. The fact that they had reproductive realities brought the association closer, that they also needed to be controlled. That escalated in the witch hunt. In the mid-1500s, women were accused to disrupt social orders with being accused of executing sex magic against men, possessing obstetrical skills, and organize as healers. And also, relevant for today, using psychedelic substances. This is a tragic image of the witch hunt. Many million people across Europe and northern US died. She argues further that the rigid dualisms of separating men and women from each other and nature and culture was also projected onto other categories that installed further dualisms, like good and bad, and mind and body, and one of the most tragic categories, I think, especially when we look at today, self and other. So that led to the organismic worldview being undermined by the mechanistic worldview in the final stage. And Valerie Plumwood calls that the master model of rationality in Western culture. That was necessary in order for the scientific revolution to take place, where nature was seen as a disorder that needed to be controlled by rational means. That was the foundation later for the Industrial Revolution. That's a very, very brief summary. I can really recommend reading this work if you're interested in this. Why is this relevant for today? Because our society is basically still organized this way. We live in the midst of an ecocide, and yeah. Terence McKenna already said, the patriarchy has been in war with entheogenes because entheogenic experiences make the maintenance of rigid hierarchies unsustainable, and that poses a major threat to patriarchy. So, fast forward into the here and now, one of the most unspoken boundary dissolutions that happened to us at the very start of our human life is almost never talked about, which is birthing. So what has fascinated me with working with women across the globe is the capacity to contain more than one potential form of life within oneself as an actuality, not as a hallucination. We don't often think about this. That's why I wanted to take a moment. And that applies to no matter what the outcome of a pregnancy is. So I want to do a quick phenomenological comparison between psychedelic states and birthing states. The main one being boundary dissolution, the direct knowledge of the self as the other, which of course reminds us of psychedelic ego dissolutions, which can also bring the internal encounter with other potential life forms. Interconnectedness and unity experiences, and what they also both have in common is that they're very polarizing, meaning they can be very empowering and cathartic, healing, but they can be also very traumatizing, difficult, or in the case of birthing, also deadly. It is very important for me to quickly mention that I don't want to essentialize anything, and what I'm going to talk about is just a little part of a wide spectrum of reproductive experiences that women undergo. Further, there's the aspect of existential transformations. A rite of passage is also what they both have in common. There is nothing like before or after birth, you're a parent afterwards. And this also applies to psychedelics. There is a before and an after identity shift, potentially. Comparing birth with psychedelics is also not new. That has been done by Aldous Huxley and by Stanislav Grof and by Terence McKenna, by many of the big male names. Problem with it is, nobody ever had the idea to talk to women how it is to birth. So there was this idea of being dropped into the world by a psychedelic or by a life force, by a womb, but there was less investigation or emphasis what it means to actually birth. And that's where I kind of want to steer the conversation towards, because it gives more agency to our experiences, because it gives us also more of a sense of responsibility of nursing and taking care of the entirety of our environment, inside and outside. So here are some anecdotal quotes, since we lack research entirely on what it is to be birthed. I gathered some quotes that leads me to the next intersection, language and framing. The birth of my child was an intensely spiritual, transformative experience, reconnecting me with the deepest parts of my being and the essence of life itself. Giving birth was like touching the very core of existence. It was a journey through pain, love, fear, and ultimately an overwhelming sense of connection and oneness with the universe. A lot of framings we know from people reporting from their journeys. More explicit even, it was getting us both very high. In fact, everybody in the room looked golden to me. Valerie, Amber, and I hung out and kind of melted into each other, fell in love. And the last quote kind of sums it up. Psychedelic language gave me a useful map of the powerful emotional terrain I would journey through in labor. Yeah, beautiful. So, being conditioned by mechanistic worldviews myself, I was thinking, what does the science say? What does neuroscience say? Well, these states that are sometimes called laborland are not just because there is this existential intensity, but also because there is a lot of different neurochemical processes going on. There's high peaks of dopamine and serotonin, opiate-like endorphins, and so on. And one of the substances that has fascinated me so much is oxytocin, in this case. We all know oxytocin is a feel-good hormone when we hug each other and so on. Well, oxytocin, also according to the study, is actually also necessary to open the cervix and making the birth possible on a physiological level. That means that the spontaneous altered states of consciousness that some women experience may well be a hallmark of physiological childbirth in humans, meaning that being able to access higher states on a hormonal level through oxytocin actually enables the opening of the cervix and the birthing of life or consciousness. And that I find very fascinating. Further, I don't have time to go more deeper into this section, but you can find me if you want to know more. I reviewed all the studies, they're not a lot. Most of the studies have been only done in the past 4 years, simply because of a lack of interest and funding. Person that has dedicated a lot of her time to research this is Orly Dahan, is a consciousness researcher, and she compared, after calling out a lacuna in neuroscience, she compared it to a case of adaptive altered states of consciousness that are associated with transient hyperfrontality. She said that the phenomenological overlaps point that this is quite possible. This is also something we know very well from psychedelic science. Further, the study came out only this year. This is an actual fMRI study of about 130 women from Barcelona that were observed right before giving birth and right after. And what the study also found that there's a very high amount of neuroplasticity at different levels and different stages, calls for more investigation. A quick wrap up. We have a lot of parallels. We have the neurophysiological parallels, neuroplasticity, possible transient hyperfrontality, strong neurochemical modulations, the rite of passage, the intensity, the interconnectedness, the vulnerability to set and setting, and something that leads me to the next section, the nonlinear and cyclical nature and reality of these experiences. Whether it is the cycles during the waves of labor, or we talk about the big fertility cycle that starts with the first menstruation and ends with the menopause, or the cycles every month. Female bodies are organized in cycles. This is a quick overview of a menstrual cycle. And you may wonder, why am I showing this at a psychedelic conference? Well, because of a phenomenological parallel, you could compare this to things like onset, peak, plateau, and drop. Or when we want to relate it more to time, preparation, journey, and integration, right? So there's this phenomenological parallel of being a cycle. But also, because the past years in the psychedelic underground, but also in other scenes, there has been more and more of a trend of menstrual awareness. So more and more women give different framings to their menstrual experiences. A big lead in this was Dr. Christine Northrup, who said, our menstrual cycles are a reflection of our overall health. By tuning into our cycle, we gain insights into our hormonal health, stress levels, and even our emotional well-being. Well, in other cultures, this would not be a big invention, because in many other cultures, especially, for example, in traditional Chinese medicine, this is very well known. And the screening of menstrual cycles, both on a psychological and physiological level, is something that's very common to do. This is a hypothetical graph that wants to illustrate why that matters for perception and consciousness, because there is a potential relationship between estrogen and brain serotonin activity. Problem is, it is historically completely under-researched. As so many things. Last week, the World Economic Forum released the numbers. Less than 1% of all research funding currently goes to research women's health issues that are related to this still. So we don't know a lot, but we do know that estrogen and brain serotonin activities have a relationship. And that also shows because 70 to 90% of all menstruating people experience something that's called premenstrual syndrome every month. Well, the premenstrual syndrome has about a list of 100 different symptoms ranging from depression, anger, anxiety, mood irritabilities, but also physiological symptoms of pain and fatigue. That matters because 5 to 8% suffer from a severe form called PMDD, which is classified by the DSM-5. How real is this? We never talk about it, right? But it's pretty real. Like half of the world's population experiences this 70 to 90%, 5 to 14 days a month, and 12 months a year. Why does it matter for psychedelic science? Because psychedelics could potentially be supportive in this. Not just this, but also to alleviate menopausal symptoms or perinatal disorders and PTSD caused by reproductive or sexual trauma. So there's a wide range that still needs to be explored because until now, even though we know that psychedelics have an impact on the brain serotonin activity on multiple levels, we have not any research on this, zero. There are a few projects that are going on. There's, I'm going to talk about it later. But how to do this, how to research this, especially if we have no information in the first hand. Well, we have to do it right. We should not repeat the mistakes of history. We should not generalize, essentialize these experiences, but we should also not leave them out. So how to do this? Psychedelia doesn't have to invent the wheel. There is movements like neurofeminism or feminist psychiatry movements, the anti-pathology approach by Dr. Jessica Taylor, who invested a lot of time in academic effort to research how to assess these tricky questions and these situations on a research level. And that means, on an applied sense, to also take into consideration environmental and socio-political factors when we're researching certain phenomena. That is also important, and that leads me to the third fascinating intersection, because psychedelics apparently also have a direct or indirect impact on the uterus and endocrine system itself. We know already from history the use of ergot alkaloids in medieval medical use, but also in the early 20th century in Germany. There has been a paper published just 2 years ago about menstrual changes and the reversal of amenorrhea, which is the absence of menstruation, induced by classic psychedelics, something that is well known in the psychedelic underground, that women report that their menstruation starts right after the intake of classic psychedelics. Of course, not for every woman, but a lot of them experience this, regardless of where they were in their cycle. What does that mean for psychedelic science? We need investigation. Further, it is known that mescaline also has possible vascular contractions of the uterus and enhances the secretion of prolactin, which is a hormone that is needed to produce milk. That's why in the Huichol tradition, mothers were given peyote for, to support nursing processes. Further, belladonna is a uterine muscle relaxant drug full of beautiful scopolamines. And then there's a current study going on, the influence of microdosing with psychedelics on menstrual-related symptoms in Maastricht. I believe there are 1 or 2 more projects in the US, but all in all, these mechanisms are under-researched. So, if altered states of birth can be induced, meaning that in some cases women experience a change of consciousness or even catharsis during birth, and the menstruation has an impact on multiple levels on how we are and perceive ourselves in the world. And in return, psychedelics interact with the uterus. Could that say that the uterus is a door of perception? We don't know. But we do know that we don't have enough information to answer this question. One last story that wants to illustrate how historically Western science has completely misread and misunderstood women and their realities, and also how science was driven by structural misogyny and sexism is the story of hysteria. Hysteria is known as a state of neurosis and like emotional extremes and irritations. Well, you'd be surprised to hear that the translation of this word in ancient Greek is uterus. And Aristotle and Plato had the idea to say that the uterus is wandering around in the body, making women crazy. So they imagined the uterus just wandering around in bodies, like a wild animal. This myth prevailed quite long. Even Hildegard von Bingen accepted this theory. Paracelsus did it. And Sigmund Freud also did it. He invented a range of very questionable treatments against hysteria. And you'd be surprised to hear that hysteria as a diagnosis was only taken out of the DSM in 1980. So we haven't got so far, I'd say. What does that mean for today? I hope this little introduction could show you that there's so much to be researched and explored in this field. But for that, we need to unpack the things that prevent us from seeing these realities. So I invite you to question the ordinary. And that means to ask difficult questions, also in the psychedelic context, questions about how we organize society, how we organize the production of knowledge, and how we frame the expansion and change of perception and consciousness. All these things need to be radically questioned when we think about gender. And I think one of the most difficult questions in psychedelia is, if non-ordinary states of consciousness are so therapeutic, what does it say about the ordinary? So we need reflections on history, knowledge production. And the good news is, there's big bodies of intellectual work that have been done throughout the ages on feminist epistemology and standpoint theory that is relevant for everybody across the gender spectrum, because feminism is there also to empower men and liberate them from very toxic archetypes that are installed in our society. So everybody can be a feminist. We need to have conversations when it's about research. We need to form strong bonds with feminist psychology movements and feminist psychiatry movements that have a strong aim to not pathologize further, to not essentialize, and to not discredit the socio-political influences, both on men and women. This goes for intersectionality. We need to address gender biases and gender blindness in research. We need to ask difficult questions. Maybe some medicines are metabolized differently throughout menstrual cycles by different people. And last, for psychedelic therapy, we need more training and more collaboration with framing reproductive trauma, sexual trauma, and internalized gender biases, because these things probably come up in psychedelic therapy. This morning, on the train, I met a psychotherapist from the Netherlands, and I had a lovely conversation. And he said, sometimes I just don't know if it's a therapeutic issue or if it's a social justice issue. And what I can share from my work, this is what I'm going to leave you with, is that there's a huge power in having conversations, and that becoming aware of social justice constructs and how our socio-political history is influencing the way we feel about ourselves, especially when it comes to unspoken things like vulnerabilities, shame, and so on. There's a huge therapeutic benefit in having these conversations. Thank you so much. Yeah, exactly.
Wow. What a beautiful roundup ending of your presentation to increase conversation. There's time for one quick question. Is there any? Yes. Ooh.
First, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a maternal and child health professor, and so looking for presentations on maternal health and even just women in this space is scarce. So thank you so much. I have lots of questions, but I'll go with my most important, which is, have you thought about, with the menstrual cycle and changes of hormone levels, timing of dosing during clinical trials, therapy, self-administration of psychedelics, and how that may differentially impact a woman's experience?
Yes, that's an awesome question. It's one of the reasons I'm happy that I was able to speak today, because we need to investigate this, because it can have both very good sides, but it can also possibly cause disturbances in the cycle. So that's what we know from this case study as well. So it's not necessarily great if a menstruation is onsetting 2 weeks too soon, right? So there's a certain rhythm to every body, and this is a very important thing to research. And I cannot answer with anything because there is no research, but I do believe that there is something about it that we need to look into. I don't think that it's completely irrelevant. And also in other health sectors, not just in psychedelic health, but in mental health in general, but also overall pharmacological research, there's more and more voices that are raised that the gender blindness approach in medical research causes so much harm. Like, women have twice as many adverse drug reactions overall. Yeah, so that has definitely an impact, and that needs to be researched. Yeah, and I'm here to connect about this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Give her a warm applause.